My name's Chris Bedson and I'm a creative director. I think the first signs, thinking back, of knowing that I wanted to be a graphic designer was probably as a small child. Always been into drawing and into cars and trucks and trains. I used to draw lorries and then I would start spending more time drawing the logos on the side of the lorry than I did on the actual lorry. So like Boots the Chemist or Eddie Stobart and stuff like that. So obviously that doesn't mean that I knew I wanted to be a graphic designer, but I think it just, looking back, it was that sort of first moment of being conscious that this was something that somebody did, I guess. And then, I mean, I grew up in a household that was not creative. You know, my dad worked in computers and my mum was a nurse. And I did well at school, like I found school pretty easy. But I was lucky in that I was not put under any pressure to do a particular thing. So even after I'd sort of aced my A-levels and said I wanted to go to art college and do foundation, that was fine, you know, so I was pretty lucky to have that. Whilst I was doing my A-levels, I had a girlfriend who was an illustrator. In fact, she is a very talented illustrator still today. And she was about to go and start a degree at Norwich Art School in illustration. And so partly out of love and infatuation, but partly because it was a pretty cool place, I applied to do foundation at Norwich Art School. So I left home, moved to Norwich, and did the foundation, which I still think was probably the best year of my life, I think, pretty much. You know, that realization that kind of everything you knew about the world or everything you thought you knew about what you were going to do just goes completely in the bin, and it's this amazing year of experimentation and discovery, and it was a pretty amazing time. Unlike quite a lot of the people on that course, I still ended up coming out and wanting to do the thing that I'd wanted to do when I went in, which is, it's pretty unusual. I think a lot of people go in thinking they're going to be a product designer and end up being a sculptor. But yeah, so I still wanted to do that, and I was pretty set on going and doing my degree at Camberwell, which was what was then the London Institute, which is now the University of the Arts, London, so along with St Martin's and Chelsea and all the rest, which was another amazing experience. And the course was run by a guy called Patrick Roberts, who I think he has like a science background or something, and there was a lot of sort of connection between like conceptual art and what he was trying to do on the course, you know. So you had Michael Craig Martin was running the Goldsmiths Fine Art course, and you had all the YBAs had just kind of, all that had happened in the mid-90s. And so I think he was quite inspired by that idea of, you know, like an idea being the basis of everything. So the whole course really was pretty much about having ideas. I mean, I sometimes joke and say we spent 3 years playing Pictionary, but we sort of did. It was like, you know, what is your idea and how are you going to communicate that visually? You know, and as soon as anybody was like, but I need to learn how to use Illustrator, or I want to know about how to set typography, he'd basically send them away with a flea in their ear. And which I think, like, looking back, I mean, at times it was annoying, but I think looking back he was right, because, you know, all that stuff, all that technical stuff you learn in about 2 months as soon as you start actually working and doing a job. And that, so, you know, when you're at school, why not just focus on the fun stuff, you know? I remember him saying as well once, like, he wasn't really interested in, I mean, it's funny, he wasn't really interested in, like, producing graphic designers. He wanted to produce art directors and creative directors. So yeah, at the end of that, like, amazing 3 years of having weird ideas, there was a degree show. My degree show consisted of a concrete golf course and some videos of tower blocks dancing. So it wasn't really graphic design. And, you know, coming out of there and then thinking, oh, crikey, now I've got to try and I don't know, get a job, I suppose, or find some way to make money doing this thing that I've been doing for 3 years. And quite soon after graduating, I met a guy called Chris Priest, who at the time was working at Ogilvy, big advertising agency, but he had been at an agency called Why Not Associates, which was a bit of a kind of like hero design agency when I was at college. You know, they were sort of famous and very well known for, you know, very experimental typography and did lots of incredible work. And so I met Chris, I think at a party, and he said he was a very generous guy, but he's like, hey, look, just come into Ogilvy and, you know, let's do some work. So I rocked up one day at Ogilvy, which was in Canary Wharf, and he sort of buzzed around. He was one of these people that just did everything at a million miles an hour. And he kind of whizzed in and out and barked a few things about, and then we just sort of set about drawing and sketching up ideas. And, you know, I worked there for about a week. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And towards the end of it, he sort of said to me, listen, I'm going to give you a few other people that you should contact. And he gave me a piece of advice, which has always actually stuck with me, which was, whenever you meet someone, make sure you leave with 2 new phone numbers. And he was like, so here's your 2 phone numbers. And one of those was Andy Outman at Why Not Associates. So I phoned him up and he said, yeah, come in. I went in, showed him my portfolio, and he said to me something along the lines of, I don't even know what this is. What are you doing here? And I said, well, it's my portfolio and I want to be a graphic designer. So I think he just sort of took pity on me and said, fine, come and work here for 2 weeks. So I did another 2-week placement with him, which again, I had no idea what I was doing. And the other number that Chris had given me was Alan Aboud. So I rang Alan after I'd been at Why Nots, and same story, I went in and met him, but he gave me a very different response. You know, he was sort of very generous, and I think he could see the ideas in the work, and I think he understood that what I'd been trying to do and what the course had been about at Camberwell. And so it was the same. He kind of said, yeah, come and work on some stuff. And then I kind of stayed there for 5 years working with Alan, which was an amazing education into the industry, really, and you know, how to basically professionalize those things that, you know, that focus on ideas, and how to turn it into, you know, real commercial work, and how to connect those two things. So within that time working with Alan at Aboud Sodano, or Aboud Creative, was, I think it kind of cemented something as well in me, where I'd always been interested in photography. I'd always loved photography. You know, I shot my own stuff, I took lots of pictures, and that kind of combination of image and typography as a form of communication, I think was ultimately, that was the sort of sweet spot of what I was interested in. And having, you know, Paul Smith has been the main client. There was other work, but that sort of was the bulk of the work. You know, that's a brand that's all about images. It's all about photography. Paul himself is passionate about photography. And so being able to kind of work on that brand and operate within that world, I think just sort of, yeah, it kind of cemented something in me in terms of like, this is the sort of stuff I want to do. You know, this is what I'm interested in. You know, I want to be concepting shoots. I want to be thinking about how we're going to develop a campaign or an idea, and how that's going to communicate this new collection or this, you know, idea that we need to talk about. So yeah, I think it was very formative for me. It kind of, you know, it laid the foundations really for what I went on to do afterwards. After leaving Aboud Sodano, after 5 years there, I went and worked for a short amount. Well, I bounced around a couple of different agencies and worked for a couple of years for Mary Portis's agency, which was called Yellow Door at the time. And that was a good experience in retrospect, but it was a bit of a culture shock in a way, because I'd gone from, you know, Alan's, which was really like 5 friends in a room. It was literally that. You know, we all got on so well. and then going into a structure that was a little bit more adversarial and, a bit more, it was more fast-paced, more commercial, more pressure for sure from the clients. I think perhaps, being young, you don't necessarily realise what you've got when you've got it, I think. And, have it like working with Alan and with a client like Paul, it was just, you had so much freedom and so much trust as well. And yeah, to go into an environment where that's not there, it was a challenge, but, no experience is wasted. And, I learned a lot, and I learned a lot from Mary as well. Like, she's an incredible woman and, a real force and very inspiring and interesting. So yeah, that was a good couple of years. And then really since then, most of my career I've been in-house at brands. So I spent some time at Links of London. I did do I did do a period of time freelancing as well. And then I've spent a long time in-house at Calvin Klein in Amsterdam as a creative director for Europe there. And I think there's a move. Well, I guess that there's a move more and more towards in-house creative anyway. I think, if I think back to early in my career in the early 2000s, it was almost a dirty word really to work in-house. It was like a bit of a sellout, or it's just going to be boring, or you just be churning stuff out, or you're part of the marketing team or whatever. Whereas I think now it's, I think some of the best work is coming from in-house teams. I think you have that kind of, that kind of incredible connection to the business and to the brand and to the other functions, and that gives you like real insight into actually what it is you're trying to do. And I think like in the current landscape as well, there's so, we have to do so much. I remember that there was like 2 Paul Smith campaigns a year, and each one had like 3 pictures or 4 pictures or something like that. And it's like now, at Calvin there were times where we were shooting, I guess, 12 things a year, and that might be 20, 30 images per shoot. So yeah, just that kind of, those brands just need stuff all the time, like more. So I think, within a sort of boutique agency setup, to try and deliver that kind of work, I think would be almost impossible. I think you have to be closer, you have to understand exactly what it's for and what you're trying to do with it, to do a good job, I think. So, I think it's definitely different, but I like it. I like being in-house. I like being close to the business. I like the way you kind of get under the skin of a brand as well. You're not just like working on something in the abstract and then handing it over. You're kind of, it's a constant evolution of creativity, I guess. I remember a photographer and now a dear friend of mine, Mel Bless, once said to me about Calvin is that it's not really a clothing brand, it's a photography brand, which is kind of true, I think. And then, so moving from that, where like you're really playing with photography, it really was like a dream in lots of ways, fantastic collaborators, brilliant photographers, filmmakers, like nobody says no to that brand really, which is amazing. Often people do graphic design and then end up as art directors. And I think there's a few different ways to get there. Like you get some people that come from like a magazine background or a styling background or something like that. But actually there's lots and lots of art directors that come from a graphic design background. And I think it's that it's about ideas. It's about using photography as a way of communicating an idea. And I think as a graphic designer, that's really ultimately what it is about. It's visual communication. And so photography, film, illustration, it's all like ingredients in a soup. So I think to end up being an art director, to be conceiving campaigns, to be on set directing photography shoots, or briefing illustrators, it all just makes sense because they're parts of the final piece of communication ultimately. I sort of veer between being completely appalled by it on a kind of macro philosophical level, and then being kind of strangely ambivalent about it at the same time. I think the industry has a history of sort of freaking out about technology. I think there was a lot of freak out about digital when it first came in, like this is going to ruin everything. And there's almost like a bell curve where things go a bit weird for a bit, and then it sort of settles down and people understand how to use it, where it's of benefit and where it's not. I've worked with lots of photographers recently that are back to shooting film again, because it's like, well, actually for this certain type of job, it's kind of better, not because necessarily of the aesthetic, but because of the process. So, not having a screen for everybody to look at, the photographer taking, owning that responsibility for the pictures a little bit more for the right kind of job. And I think we'll probably get to the same kind of place with AI, I imagine. It's like, okay, there are areas where we'll use it and there'll be areas where we won't, because we won't want it. I think you already see it with, Gen Z's kind of aversion to technology, actually, a lot of the time. I mean, I read something recently about how, younger people, when they're going into retail environments, actually don't want to see tech. They don't want screens because they've got a screen in their hand all the time. I'm in a shop. I want to see real things and speak to humans. So I think in the end it will probably level out. I mean, I think, but yeah, the macros of it is a little bit scary. I mean, I tend to agree with the sort of Naomi Klein take on AI, which is, yes, it could remove like mundane tasks and improve all our lives if we lived within a system that valued human experience, but we don't really. We live in a system that exploits people and resources for profit. So I think within that system, that's quite scary. And her view is it's more about who's in control of it than the technology itself, which I tend to agree with. But no, on a more micro level, yeah, sure, we're using it. I find it quite amusing, some of the things it spits out sometimes. Yeah, I think it's going to, it will feature more and more. But I tend to think we'll all find a way to live with it and understand how to use it in a way that makes sense. I think one of the best bits of advice I got was on a shoot once with an amazing photographer, Robert Wyatt, and he, I was kind of buzzing around. We were on this amazing location, and I was like, let's shoot over here, let's do this, let's shoot over there. And we got the first shot, and I'm like, okay, next I want to try this, Rob. And he just sort of put his arm around me and said, Chris, let's just do it all here. This is working. And of course he was right. And I think it's a nice story because it just sort of shows how sometimes you just have to have the courage of your conviction. If something's working, just keep going with it. You don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel every 5 minutes. It's okay to do the same thing again. So if I had to give advice to young creatives coming out of college now, I think I'd probably repeat what Chris Priest said to me, which is like, leave every meeting with 2 phone numbers. I think don't underestimate the power of meeting people. The world is so digital at the moment. Like, you've got your social media, you might have an amazing portfolio, a brilliant website, and you can email as many people as you like and get a really good LinkedIn profile. But I still think ultimately, meeting someone's eye, meeting them face to face, having that human connection is really where you'll find the opportunities. I think, it's an industry that I think sometimes can feel very closed, but actually is also very open if you can get to meet people. And I think, actually there's a lot of generosity and a lot of support out there for people if you reach out and ask for it. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing I'd say as well is, like, don't think that the way it is now is the way it's always going to be. I think it's always changing. It's constantly shifting. It's not even a very old industry, if we think about it. So it's like, it's always going to change. And also I think a lot of the people in senior positions in this industry, they gatekeep it. If we're honest, it's like they put their own name on the door, literally, and so it can be hard to affect change and or do things in a different way within an organisation where someone's name's on the door. So don't be afraid to kind of do your own thing and find your own way and yeah, just be ready for how it might evolve in the next 5 years. I mean, everybody loves to talk about, try and predict how it's changing or what's going to happen in a few years. I think it's kind of pointless because we don't really know. We just got to be ready for whatever it's going to be like. A couple of things I forgot to talk about when we were speaking just now. One is, in a way, in reference to AI, in a sense, there's always been an artificiality to advertising images, to images used to sell us stuff or to convince us to do things or whatever. So in that sense, like, what's the difference? Everybody's freaking out about authenticity, but is any of this stuff really all that authentic anyway? That was one thought. Second thought was in reference to what a creative director is like or what they do. And I think a lot of the time there's this idea of this kind of, godlike creative Svengali sitting in a gilded Eames chair, spurting out amazing ideas. And I think, in reality, I don't really think it's like that. And, if it ever was like that, I just think increasingly it isn't. And I think it's much more about, collaboration and iteration and trying stuff and failing and realizing it was wrong and trying again. And yeah, I think it's, that's how I approach it anyway. And I think it's, maybe it's a bit healthier. Anyway, thanks. Bye.